When I entered that cold, dark cell, the 3 prisoners already had their clubs out, and they quickly ordered me to sit down. Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the channel Infidelity Stories. In this true account that I wrote by hand, I will tell you how I saved my husband's life while he was imprisoned in a jail in Springfield. My name is Amanda. I am 25 years old, and I live in Springfield, Illinois. I've been married for 2 years to Jefferson, who is 30. My husband works as a delivery driver for a delivery app while I am a call center agent at a local mall. Our story began at a funk dance party in our neighborhood. From the moment we met, it was as if a spark had been lit between us. That love at first sight that people talk about, that's exactly how it was. At the start of our relationship, we faced a challenge that almost ruined everything. Jefferson ended up at the police station because of a fight with a delivery customer. The customer insisted that he bring the delivery up to his apartment door, but Jefferson, following work rules, refused. The situation quickly got out of hand, and they ended up having a serious fight. Both were taken to the police station, but in the end, my husband was the one who took the blame. It was a tough time for us. We had to pay a considerable amount to hire a lawyer and make bail to ensure he wouldn't be jailed. Despite these difficulties, we faced everything together, and our relationship emerged stronger than ever. But after that incident, I had a serious talk with him about the need to be calmer and not lose his temper with everyone. Jefferson has a strong personality and always thought of himself as a tough guy in any situation. However, to my dismay, in 2024, he got into another fight. But this time, it was much more serious. We were at a well-known party in Springfield where several famous country music singers perform over 2 nights. It's an event that practically stops the entire city. Everyone goes to enjoy it. During the party, we were peacefully drinking with some friends when one of them bumped into another man, starting an argument. Things quickly escalated, with both men threatening each other. Seeing his friend in trouble, Jefferson stepped in. You know how men are. When one is in trouble, everyone bands together to defend him. My husband tried to calm the situation, asking the man to walk away. But instead of diffusing the situation, things worsened. One of the man's friends threw a drink in our direction, and the liquid ended up soaking me. Jefferson couldn't hold back when he saw this and lunged at them. The fight was brutal, and the worst part was that one of the men involved was the spoiled son of a wealthy and influential man in town. Our fate was sealed at that moment. After that incident at the party, everything began to crumble for us. We were trying to move on, but we knew that something bad could happen at any moment. Things were tense at home, and my husband was constantly worried, although he tried to hide it. Days later, when everything seemed to be calming down, we were surprised by a knock at the door. It was the police. My heart raced, and for a moment, I hoped it was a mistake. But it wasn't. They were there to arrest Jefferson. Before I continue with this real story of betrayal, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The police entered with a firm stance, explaining that they were there to execute an arrest warrant. The charge was serious: aggravated assault and battery. Especially considering my husband had previous offenses for past fights, and the father of the guy Jefferson hurt was a powerful man in town. This complicated everything further. There was no way out. I watched in panic as they handcuffed Jefferson. He didn't resist, but frustration and anger were written all over his face. He turned to me and said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of this." But I knew it wouldn't be so simple this time. The legal process began quickly after that day, and it soon became clear that we were in serious trouble. With Jefferson's history and the influence of the man's father, the chances of bail were practically zero. The lawyer we hired did what he could, but the evidence and witness testimonies against him were too strong. In the end, the judge sentenced Jefferson to 2 years in prison for assault, without the possibility of bail due to his violent history. The sentence was harsh, and reality began to sink in. My husband was going to prison, and this time there was no easy way out. I watched as he was taken from the courtroom. It was devastating. I wanted to scream, run after him, do something, anything, but I was paralyzed. After crying in the courtroom, I signed the papers and spoke with the lawyer about appealing and trying to reduce the sentence. I left with my heart shattered, unable to believe what was happening. When I got home, I collapsed onto the living room floor, crying harder than ever before. The feeling of emptiness and despair was overwhelming. The first weeks were the hardest. I felt lost, as if a part of me had been forcefully ripped away. The house was too quiet, and every corner reminded me of Jefferson. I tried to keep up with my routine, but the sadness paralyzed me. I could barely talk to my husband during that time. I only received occasional updates from the lawyer about the appeal process. After nearly 40 agonizing days, I was finally granted permission to see my husband in person during the much-anticipated conjugal visit. I received a detailed protocol explaining that visits would occur every 15 days, subject to cancellation or change if he committed any infractions inside the prison. When I opened the email with the instructions, I felt a mix of relief and nervousness. It was an important step in trying to maintain our connection, but the context was difficult to digest. The idea of seeing Jefferson in that situation, behind bars, made me anxious, but I knew I had to be strong. The weeks of waiting had been unbearable, and I was desperate to hug him, look into his eyes, and try to find some comfort amid the chaos that had taken over our lives. On the day of the visit, I carefully prepared myself. I wanted Jefferson to feel as comfortable as possible. I did my nails in the color he always complimented and even got a tan to make those bikini lines he loved. I chose a special lingerie set and made sure my hair and makeup were perfect. I wanted him to feel that I was still there for him, completely, even in these difficult circumstances. When everything was ready, I called an Uber and headed to the penitentiary where Jefferson was being held. On the way, I tried to stay calm, but the anxiety was ever present. When I arrived, I saw several women waiting outside, some mothers, others wives, all with the same mission, to visit their loved ones behind bars. The silent solidarity among us was palpable, but each of us was lost in our own thoughts and worries. After some time, a prison guard came out and called us to form a line. He briefly explained the procedure, and shortly after, the gates finally opened. My heart raced. I knew that despite everything, this was an important moment for us both. When my turn came, I was taken to a room where I had to fill out an enormous registration form. They asked for all my information, even my blood type. After completing the form, I was called into a private room where a woman thoroughly explained the rules and procedures I had to follow. She checked what I had brought for Jefferson, recorded every item, and finally searched me as well. After everything was cleared, she led me to a large courtyard surrounded by tall iron fences. In the center, several prisoners were talking to their family members. The prison guard led me to Jefferson. When I saw him, I couldn't hold back my tears of joy and relief. He stood up as soon as he saw me, but what caught my attention most was the look in his eyes, a mix of insecurity and worry that I wasn't used to seeing in the strong man I had always known. When I got closer, I noticed that his face was bruised and his eyes were a bit swollen. My heart sank seeing him in that state. Without hiding my concern, I immediately asked, "What happened, my love? Why are you all bruised? I can't believe you're getting into fights in here." Jefferson lowered his head for a moment before looking me in the eyes. "This place is hell, Amanda," he began, his voice filled with bitterness. "The older prisoners extort the newcomers, forcing them to give up cigarettes, food, anything they can get. And those who have nothing to offer, well, they get beaten and face the consequences." Those words hit me like a punch. Seeing Jefferson in that condition and hearing about what he was going through was devastating. The man who had always tried to protect me was now in a situation where he needed protection himself. The brutal reality of prison was etched into every injury he bore, and all I wanted was to get him out of there. I asked Jefferson to make a list of the items that the other prisoners were asking for, promising that I would do everything I could to help him stay out of trouble. I knew it wasn't the ideal solution, but anything that could ease his torment inside was a relief to my heart. After he vented about everything he had gone through, I tried to lighten the mood by asking him to think of better things. With a mischievous smile, I mentioned that I was wearing his favorite lingerie, the one he always loved seeing, on me. "I want to show you in a more private place," I whispered, hoping it would bring him some comfort and distraction. Jefferson, without hesitation, took my hand and led me to the other side of the courtyard, where some reserved cells were covered with sheets, creating a space for privacy during intimate moments. The surroundings were still oppressive, but for a moment it felt like it was just the two of us, trying to regain a bit of what we had lost, trying to reconnect in the middle of this hell. When we entered the cell, I was greeted by a dark, cold environment. There was a bunk bed against the wall, a dim light barely illuminating the space, and a small window with bars high up, allowing just a sliver of natural light to come in. This was the closest thing to privacy we could have here. I couldn't let myself be overwhelmed. I had to be strong and show Jefferson that I was by his side, ready to take care of him, even in this horrible place. Without hesitation, I grabbed him firmly. The time for the visit was running out, and we couldn't waste a second. In that instant, all the tension of the past weeks transformed into desire and need. We had an intimate moment of love right there in that cold, grim cell, as if the world around us had disappeared. It was much more intense. My husband had been without any relations for weeks, and for a brief moment, I saw a smile of happiness on his face. Seeing him like this only motivated me more. I couldn't hold back and went for him again, wanting more and more, just like he did. But we were interrupted by the siren that echoed through the courtyard. The voice of the prison guards, firm and authoritative, announced that there were only 2 minutes left before the end of the visit and that everyone needed to head out of the yard immediately. The heat of the moment gave me the strength to react quickly. I hurriedly got dressed, trying to keep my composure and not let the desperation I felt show. Jefferson also dressed quickly. We couldn't delay, not even by a second. In that prison, any delay was viewed with suspicion, as if we were doing something far worse than simply enjoying the few moments of permitted visitation. The exit from the courtyard was a race against time. All the visitors, including me, were strictly escorted out, with no room for mistakes or delays. I returned home with renewed determination to help my husband in any way I could. The next visit would be different. I was preparing to bring everything Jefferson had asked for to try and keep the peace around him inside the prison. My goal was to ensure he had what he needed to stay out of trouble. That night, I called the lawyer, desperate for some guidance or help. I explained the situation and mentioned the assaults Jefferson had been suffering in prison. However, the lawyer, with his calm and professional voice, informed me that, unfortunately, he couldn't do anything to resolve the situation directly. He said Jefferson's safety and survival inside depended on how he handled the challenges of the prison environment. Frustrated, I hung up the phone, feeling a mix of helplessness and anger. Despite the lawyer's rational explanations, he couldn't ease the pain I felt at not being able to do more for my husband. 15 days later, I returned for another conjugal visit, hoping that things had improved for Jefferson. This time, the process went much faster since I had already registered during the previous visit. I passed the inspection smoothly and headed to the courtyard with the items I brought for him. When I arrived, Jefferson was waiting for me, and seeing him without any bruises was a huge relief. A wave of happiness washed over me, and I hugged him tightly. I asked him if the assaults had stopped, and he responded, "They don't hit me anymore, but they still treat me like a servant. I have to wash their clothes, give them my meals, clean their cells. I'm basically being used as a slave." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, but I tried not to show my concern. I smiled at him and showed him what I had brought: cigarettes, food, canned goods, anything I could gather to help. Jefferson looked at the items with a mixture of surprise and relief, and a timid smile appeared on his face. "This will make a big difference," he said, his eyes filled with gratitude. We spent some time talking, trying to forget, even for a few moments, the harshness of the situation. But as we were chatting, I noticed Jefferson's expression suddenly change. 3 prisoners walked by, and he immediately lowered his head, falling into complete silence. I looked at the men, trying to understand what was happening. One of them caught my gaze and turned to look at me with disdain. "What's that pretty little thing looking at? Want to get a taste of Daddy's hammer?" he taunted, his tone full of threat. Those words shocked me, and for a moment, I was speechless. I quickly averted my gaze to Jefferson, who still had his head down. The tension was thick in the air, and I felt my heart racing. The man spat on the ground, and seeing that neither of us was going to react, he turned and walked away with his 2 cronies, leaving a lingering sense of fear and helplessness behind. Jefferson slowly raised his head, and the look of worry and sadness in his eyes was clear. "They run things here. They're from a well-known gang and control the place," he murmured, his voice tinged with fear. My heart clenched, feeling the pain and humiliation he was going through. Even though I had tried to make the visit as comfortable as possible, the harsh reality of prison life was brutal and oppressive. Determined, I stood up from where I was, sitting, and without hesitation, walked in the direction of the men who had threatened Jefferson. He tried to grab my arm, but I raised my hand, motioning for him to let go, and kept moving forward. My steps were firm as I walked towards the table where the prisoners were sitting. When I got close, I took a deep breath and spoke with a determination that masked my nervousness. "Hey you, I want to talk and make a deal. That man is my husband, and I don't want you hurting him or forcing him to do anything anymore. Tell me your price, and at the next visit, I'll personally deliver what you want." The men exchanged surprised looks, clearly taken aback by my boldness. The leader of the group, the same one who had made the threat, raised an eyebrow and chuckled, clearly amused by my courage. "You're trying to make a deal, huh? That's not how things work around here, lady. But since you're willing to pay, we can talk," he said, laughing. They began discussing among themselves, and I stood firm, trying to show that I was ready to do anything to protect Jefferson. My heart was racing, and I could feel the tension rising as the words were exchanged. They didn't seem in a hurry, sizing up the situation and deciding what would be a fair price for what I was trying to negotiate. After a few minutes, one of the men looked at me and spoke. "Let's do it like this. Next visit, you come nice and pretty, all dolled up. You'll be the payment. If not, you can be sure your husband will suffer more than he already has." Those words left me terrified, but I knew I had no way out. What I had done had only made things worse for Jefferson, and I deeply feared what might happen to him once the visit was over if I didn't agree to what they were asking. Keeping my composure, I replied firmly, "If that's what you want, I'll give it. But don't you dare lay a finger on my husband again." One of the men cursed at me, calling me a loud-mouthed cow for my boldness, but the leader of the group motioned for him to calm down and corrected him. "Don't curse at the lady. She's now a guest of honor." I felt a momentary sense of relief hearing that, but the tension still lingered. Before leaving, I told them I'd bring what they wanted on the next visit and seal the deal. I returned to where Jefferson was sitting, and the distress on his face was evident. When I sat down, he exploded. "Are you crazy? Look what you've done. You went and talked to them, and now you've made my life even worse in here. I'm going to end up dead." Trying to maintain my calm and confidence, I spoke to him with a firmness that belied my own fear. "Stop being a coward and act like a man. I've made sure they won't bother you anymore. Now we just have to fulfill the deal and do what they asked for. I'm doing my best to protect you." Jefferson seemed somewhat relieved, but the worry was still written all over his face. He knew the situation was far from resolved, but the fact that I was doing something to help him was, in some way, a small comfort. When Jefferson asked me what I had to give in exchange for his peace, I knew I had to be honest, no matter how difficult it was. I took a deep breath, and with a trembling voice, I told him what the man had asked for. As I spoke, Jefferson remained silent, taking in every word. When I finished, he stayed quiet for a moment, which only made me more nervous. Then, finally, he responded, "I wanted to ask you to do this, but I didn't have the courage. One of the guys I met in here told me that these men accept payments for protection by offering their wives in exchange. My heart sank hearing that. I knew prison life was hard, but hearing Jefferson admit that he had thought about asking me to do something so terrible left me devastated. He was being consumed by the harsh reality of that place, and the idea of sacrificing me to ensure his safety was eroding what little dignity he had left. "I know it's horrible," he continued, "but things are different in here. It's not an easy choice. I never wanted you to go through this, but the truth is, I'm scared. Really scared." I looked at the clock on my wrist and realized there were only a few minutes left in our visit. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on me, but I had to stay strong, both for myself and for Jefferson. I held his hand tightly and looked into his eyes. "Everything is going to be okay. I promise I'll figure this out. They'll never hurt you again. We'll get through this together, no matter what." The shrill sound of the siren signaled the end of the visit. I quickly stood up, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to fall. With one last look at Jefferson, I whispered, "Stay strong. I'll be back soon." He simply nodded, his face still filled with worry, as I walked away, feeling the weight of the decisions I would have to make. As I left the prison, my mind was already racing, trying to figure out how I would deal with those men in the next visit. I didn't know exactly what I would do, but I was determined to find a solution, even if it meant sacrificing more than I had ever imagined. When I got home, I was overwhelmed with emotions. I considered calling the lawyer and telling him everything, but I knew that might only make things worse for Jefferson. His safety now depended entirely on me, and I had to handle the situation alone. The days passed, and the date of the next conjugal visit approached. I was anxious and terrified, but then, an unexpected phone call from the lawyer brought temporary relief. He informed me that Jefferson was doing well and that the prisoners had stopped bothering him. That news renewed my courage and made me feel that despite everything, there was still a chance to keep things under control. On the day of the visit, I prepared myself as carefully as ever. I chose clothes I thought would be appropriate, dressed meticulously, and headed to the prison, determined to fulfill the agreement. This time, though, the visit had a different purpose. I wasn't there for Jefferson. I was there for the man who had been beating him. When I arrived at the penitentiary, I went through the usual procedures with the same precision. The inspection was quick, and I made my way to the courtyard where the prisoners and their families were. Jefferson was waiting for me, but unlike previous visits, I didn't head straight to him. Today I was there for someone else, to fulfill the agreement. With my heart pounding, I walked toward the table where the man was sitting with his cronies. It was a situation I never imagined facing, but I knew it was necessary. As I approached, the man greeted me with a calculating look, and as I sat down at the table, I knew I was about to seal a deal that would compromise my own dignity. "You're looking all nice today, aren't you? That husband of yours is a wimp, cries about everything. Today, I'm going to show you what it's like to be with a real man," he said, his words coarse and his gaze challenging. Despite the offensive words and his intimidating demeanor, I kept calm. I looked at him firmly and replied, "Don't give me that talk. Jefferson is a man like any other in here. If you want to negotiate, let's get straight to it and stop wasting time." He raised an eyebrow, clearly pleased with my defiant attitude, and motioned for us to head to the conjugal cell. As we walked, I could feel Jefferson's eyes on me from afar, gnawing his nails in anxiety over what was about to happen. We entered the conjugal cell that had been set aside for this kind of visit. The room was dark and cold as usual, but I was resolute. Once inside, I didn't waste any time. With cold determination, I began to undress and approach the man. The moment was filled with rage. Not just for the situation Jefferson was in, but for the way my life had turned into a nightmare. The moment I stood face to face with him in that cold, dimly lit cell, I was consumed by an overwhelming sense of anger, not just at the situation, but at the world that had pushed me into this nightmare. This wasn't the life I had imagined for myself, and certainly not for Jefferson. But here I was, forced into a compromise that was tearing me apart from the inside. As I undressed and approached him, the man's arrogant smirk widened, clearly enjoying the power he held over me. He pulled me toward him roughly, and I did my best to hide the disgust that was building inside me. My mind was racing, filled with thoughts of Jefferson, the sacrifices we had both made, and how I had ended up in this position. Every fiber of my being wanted to fight back, but I knew that this was about survival, both mine and Jefferson's. The act itself was quick, cold, and mechanical. It was nothing like what I had with Jefferson. No connection, no warmth, just a transaction. When it was over, the man lay back on the bunk, looking smug and satisfied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigarette, lighting it casually. He offered me one, and although I don't smoke, I took it. I needed something to distract me from the overwhelming mix of emotions crashing through me. We sat there in silence for a few minutes, smoking, while I tried to process everything that had just happened. My mind was a blur, but I knew one thing for sure. I had done what I needed to do to keep Jefferson safe. That thought was the only thing that kept me from breaking down completely. Finally, I gathered the courage to speak. "We have an agreement now. I've done my part. Now you keep your end of the deal." The man chuckled, his laugh filled with the kind of cruelty that only someone in complete control could have. Yeah. You did your part, but don't think that means your man is in the clear. Forever. You bought him some time, sure, but in this place, nothing lasts forever. Those words hit me like a punch in the stomach. He was playing with me, knowing full well that I didn't have many options. He wasn't going to let Jefferson off the hook easily, and I realized that this was just the beginning of a long, dark road. I stood up quickly, getting dressed as fast as I could. I didn't want to stay in that cell a moment longer. The man continued to lie there, completely unconcerned, as if nothing had just happened. Before I walked out, I turned to him one last time, my voice trembling but firm. "You better keep your word. If anything happens to my husband, I'll make sure you regret it." He only laughed again, waving me off dismissively as I left the cell. The moment I stepped back into the courtyard, I felt like I could finally breathe again. But the relief was short-lived. Jefferson was standing nearby, waiting for me, his face pale and filled with anxiety. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The look in my eyes told him everything. I walked over to him, forcing a smile as I tried to reassure him. "It's done. We made a deal, and you're safe now." Jefferson didn't say anything at first. He just lowered his head, clearly ashamed of the situation, of the fact that I had to go through something like this to protect him. After a long moment, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Amanda. I never wanted it to come to this." I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tightly. "It's not your fault. We're in this together, and no matter what happens, I'll do whatever it takes to get you out of here." The siren blared again, signaling the end of the visit. I kissed Jefferson one last time, whispered for him to stay strong, and walked away, my heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened during that visit. The guilt, the anger, and the helplessness all swirled inside me, making it hard to focus on anything else. I considered calling the lawyer, asking if there was any way to speed up Jefferson's case, but deep down, I knew that the legal process would take time. Time we didn't have. The days dragged on, and soon enough, it was time for the next visit. This time, I felt like I was walking into the prison with a heavier burden. I wasn't just there to see my husband. I was there to maintain a twisted agreement that kept him safe. As I went through the usual procedures, my mind was filled with anxiety. What if the man asked for more? What if the agreement changed? I wasn't sure how much more of this I could take. When I entered the courtyard, Jefferson was already waiting for me. His face lit up when he saw me, but I could still see the worry in his eyes. He knew, just as I did, that our lives were now in the hands of those men. Before I could go to him, I saw the man from the previous visit standing nearby, watching me. He motioned for me to come over, and my heart sank. I didn't want to do this again. I didn't want to live like this, but what choice did I have? As I walked toward him, I took a deep breath, trying to prepare myself for whatever was about to happen. But before I could say anything, the man spoke, his tone casual, but with a hint of menace. "You did good last time. Your husband's still in one piece, isn't he? But like I said, deals like this don't last forever. If you want him to keep breathing, you know what you need to do." I felt sick to my stomach, but I nodded, knowing I had no choice but to agree. I was trapped in this cycle, and every visit meant another sacrifice, another piece of myself lost to this nightmare. The days ahead seemed darker than ever. Each visit became a reminder of the cost I had to pay to keep Jefferson safe. I tried to focus on the hope that maybe, just maybe, the lawyer would find a way to get him out early for good behavior. But until then, I was stuck in this prison, just as much as Jefferson was. And as much as I tried to be strong, to keep my focus on protecting him, the reality of what I was doing was slowly tearing me apart. End of the story. Before you leave, remember to subscribe to the channel by activating the Tinker Bell to receive notification every time.